I've been thinking about how to share my life in Olmsted. And what I realize is that Mr. Olmsted began to influence my life when my mother and father were courting, and my father proposed to my mother in Beardsley Park in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And after I was born and quite young, I spent a great deal of time with my grandparents and other family members in Beardsley Park. And then my folks moved to New Haven, Connecticut, very close to Edgewood Park. And I remember this park as having a great big entry area and a flat area with benches and swings. And then you would walk down a wooded hillside with a great long set of wooden stairs. You would very carefully cross a street inside the park. And then there would be a pond full of course, ducks. And when I left New Haven, went off to college, and then returned when my husband was at Yale Medical School, I found Edgewood Park again because I had a little girl. And we spent many happy days, many happy hours in Edgewood Park. And so that park and Beardsley Park were really important to me. When we moved to Brookline and bought a home on Pill Hill, which it turned out was only a block and a half up from the Emerald Necklace, and our particular segment was called Olmsted Park, and it included Jamaica Pond, which has a really flat area on the top where children play. And then you walk down a really long set of wooden stairs on a wooded hillside to a pond full of ducks. So I knew that I had come home. I didn't know who Mr. Olmsted was, but I asked, and our neighborhood group began to talk with our municipalities, both Boston and Brookline, because the Emerald Necklace is shared in places by both municipalities. We began to ask them about the park, and we were treated to a visit to Fairstead, where there were hundreds of plans about the Emerald Necklace. And I sort of say, and the rest is history, because so many of us realize that was the beginning in the 1970s of the movement toward Olmsted Park restorations, not only in Boston and Brookline, but around the country. So I was luckily part of the group of people who were the founders of the National Association for Olmsted Parks in Buffalo in the winter, very cold winter of 1979, 1980. I was one of the people who formed the Massachusetts Association for Olmsted Parks, which was the first NAOP statewide affiliate. We created the Olmsted Historic Landscape Preservation Program with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And that research and the development of the master plan became the base for all the work that is currently being done with the Commonwealth, with Boston, with Brookline, and the Army Corps of Engineers. So my entire professional life, but also my personal life, has been influenced by Mr. Olmsted, because part of the process of getting to know scholars and preservationists and community activists meant that we have created a network that was both professional and personal. So I am so grateful for the relationships, for the generosity of the scholars, for the determination of all the people who now make up the National Association for Olmsted Parks. But one of my expressions of gratitude has to be right now, as we celebrate Olmsted's 200th birthday, is to Dee Dee and her troops for the absolutely extraordinary, amazing work that has been going on to lead to NAOP being the core of a national movement. And while it's celebration culminates on the 26th, and shortly after, the real beauty is going to be what happens after the birthday bash, to make sure that we end up with lots of new friends, an enlarged and enhanced network, and a commitment from the stewards of the park, both those who have a legal responsibility, but also those who come to know and love these spaces and will partner with the legal stewards, so that we will move forward and we will always have parks that are safe, accessible, well-maintained, and places of respite for everybody. So, Mr. Olmsted, thank you for changing my life, and happy birthday. Well, I think the most exquisite component of Olmsted's vision for me is the fact that his parks are places where there really is democracy and dirt, where everyone is welcome, where you, like the public library, it's one of the few places left in society where you can come, spend as much time as you want, and have no cost except interest and commitment. So his vision of parks for people, all kinds of people, was always critical for me. I'm enthusiastic about the passive landscape, because I think that there's plenty of organized support for baseball fields and football fields and soccer fields. But what the Olmsted movement has achieved is a growing and enhanced commitment for passive open space and its value to a community. Well, my introduction to the need for NAOP was that weekend in Buffalo, when we had people from around the country who were telling their stories about the challenges in their neighborhoods. And what we realized is we were all telling the same story. We needed a way to encourage the people responsible for our parks and open spaces to halt the not so benign neglect that had been affecting their safety and their maintenance for far too long. And the decision to create the National Association for Olmsted Parks was made by scholars, Dr. Charles McLaughlin and Charlie Beveridge, and it was made by community activists who didn't know very much about Olmsted, but who knew a whole lot about what the parks meant to the community. And so I offered to do a conference right after our meeting in Buffalo, to be held in the spring of 1981, which luckily coincided with the National Park Service Department of the Interior decision to accept Fairstead as a National Historic Site. So it gave us the integrity of information at Fairstead and the passionate commitment by community activists to make sure that we understood and researched what the parks were meant to be, what the original design intent was, before we spent any money changing things. So NAOP became the hub, both for the scholars and community activists, to make sure that we had a way to communicate together and to share information. And I will say that those of us who came to it because we cared about public open spaces had the gift of people like Charlie Beveridge, who would not only answer the phone from people he didn't know, but would provide information that we could then use to communicate with our elected officials to begin to affect and enhance the budgets that we needed to make our parks beautiful again. What a generous, wonderful, thoughtful man. When I got the millions of dollars for the Olmsted Historic Landscape Preservation Program in Massachusetts, because my neighbor, Michael Dukakis, was a governor and said, go do it. And I called Charlie and I said, we now have all this money and we don't know what to do with it. Will you be the consultant for this program and help us figure out how to do this? Not skipping a beat, he said, oh, of course, I'll be there. And that's Charlie's answer all the time. Every time he is needed, he is there. He's just an extraordinary man. And what we have learned from his 3x5 cards, that was the beginning of the master list, the Olmsted inventory, to what it is now online, is just extraordinary. The man led us through the forest and made sure we didn't set fire to it. He is quite a guy. I think what's interesting is, in the beginning, when things were really desperate and parks were being desecrated and school buildings were being dropped in by parachute, what the NAOP did was twofold. One, we had what we called SWAT teams. And when we were asked, members of the board would go, 3, 4, 5 of us, and spend 2- and 3-day weekends in places, meeting with the constituents, meeting with the park commissioners, meeting with the elected officials, meeting with the press, trying to make sure that the community had the kind of attention to the issue and could make the comparisons and the analogies to what was going on elsewhere, to help them get the energy behind preserving what was at risk. And if you can get funding to do that again, to continue to be the key organization around which the community can bring others to fight the good fight, I think that's a role that needs to continue. I will tell you one last story. Charlie McLaughlin, well, two pieces of a story. When I met Dr. McLaughlin in Buffalo, we were sitting at a table at the dinner, and he said to me, tell me, what you think of Mr. Olmsted. And I said, well, I've just finished at Simmons College. It took me 20 years after starting at Sweetbriar College and then having a family and then finishing at Simmons. And I think that Mr. Olmsted must have been influenced by Wordsworth's poetry and vision. And he said to me, you could be right. So I mentioned this later to someone who said to me, you know who that is? And I said, well, you mean Professor McLaughlin? And they said, Professor McLaughlin, who is the editor-in-chief for the Olmsted Papers at the Library of Congress. He might well have known that before you mentioned it. And I thought, oh, geez, So turns out that Charlie McLaughlin and I become the national co-chairs of the NAOP the second year. And he is the genius and I am the community loudmouth. And we're having this wonderful time. And then I've had a lot of back surgery and knee surgery. And we're supposed to go to Chicago. And I was on the phone with him and I said to him, I can't. I'm in a wheelchair. I can't. And there's this long silence. And then he says, oh, really? You're in a wheelchair, so you can't go? And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm speaking to the man who lives in a wheelchair. He said, I tell you what, you get yourself to O'Hare and I'll meet you there and it'll be a royal welcome. And so my husband said to me, I will get you there. So I get to Chicago and I'm getting pushed down the ramp. And there is Dr. Charles McLaughlin, a very dignified man with a gold paper crown on his head and a cape and a scepter in his hand and a set for me for my royal welcome. And we got wheeled through O'Hare and everybody looked as if we were, must be royalty because, you know. So, you know, for Mr. Olmsted, you go where you need to go and you do what you need to do. And if you can't walk, find somebody to wheel you, but get yourself there. That NAOP as an organization continue to incorporate scholars and preservationists and community activists and municipal and state officials so that all the planners and the decision makers have the gift of the scholarship so they understand the design intent and the landscape with which they're working. Two, I hope that what Dee Dee has created in terms of the managing partnership with all the major organizations whose primary focus is not Olmsted, but is related, and those who have now become involved because of Olmsted 200 will stay with it. And three, that there will be sufficient funding so that all the action that has taken place this last year can continue in various forms, that the need for philanthropic initiatives is critical. And sometimes, like a capital investment in a park, it's sexy and the ribbon cutting is wonderful, but the real issue comes after the ribbon cutting, to keeping the momentum going, to keeping the maintenance going, to making sure that the constituency for that space and all those spaces remains strong. I had a call from Jerry Wright, who was one of the early activists around Jamaica Pond restoration. And he said, you know, Olmsted's birthday's coming up. This is 10 years ago. How about we go to lunch and celebrate? And I said, okay. So we went off to a pub called Matt Murphy's in Brookline Village. And we talked about what we could do to celebrate the 200th anniversary. And Jerry said, well, why don't we create Olmsted 2022? And we'll see if we can get the National Association of Olmsted Parks to help us and be the center of action. And we only have 10 years, so we need to start now. And so we started in the Boston area by holding a conference at Simmons College and gathering everybody we knew to talk about Olmsted. And we talked to the scholars at the national level, and we touched base with board members at the NAOP. And the board said, well, that's a very interesting idea. And then for a little while, nothing happened. And then this miracle called Dee Dee appeared. And it just took off and became what Jerry and I thought would be a miracle of excitement and commitment and an enhanced devotion to making sure that Mr. Olmsted's work was never again left to deteriorate. There's an introduction in the first real biography of Olmsted, and in the preface, she talks about the fact that when Olmsted Parks were created, They were beloved and revered by the populace, and that 25 years later, they had been left to decline and deteriorate. And I cut out that preference. God forgive me for cutting up a book. I cut out that preference and I carried it with me to every meeting that we had about the Olmsted Conference in Boston, about creating the Boston Park Rangers program, about working with the National Register people to be sure that we could include historic landscapes with historic structures. I've never forgotten how quickly you can lose something precious by not keeping up the momentum. And so Laura Woodroper's words about Mr. Olmsted's work are a touchstone for me. And I think the message has to be from Olmsted 200, never let go, never give up. Make sure that the park that is your park is as well taken care of anything else in your life.